Welcome, everyone, to UC Berkeley's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, where we bring community and campus together to experience the joy and benefits of public dialogue and exchange. Today, our town hall meeting is being held in Berkeley's spring semester, and we are delighted to have so many of you listening, asking questions, and being a part of the interchange of ideas. Joining us are three esteemed colleagues. Cynthia Kaufman is the director of the Vasconcelos Institute for Democracy and Action at De Anza College, where she runs, teaches in, and community organizes training programs. She is the author of 5 books on social change, including The Sea is Rising and So Are We, a climate justice handbook. Tamim Ansary is an Afghan-American author whose works, such as Destiny Disrupted, A History of the World Through Islamic Eyes, and West of Kabul, East of New York, where he explores issues that arise in zones where cultures and civilizations overlap. Tamim has taught a variety of OLLI courses on these and related themes since 2001. And then Darren Zook teaches in political science and global studies at UC Berkeley. His areas of interest include comparative politics, human rights, and international law. He has received numerous teaching awards for his creativity in the classroom and was recently named one of the top 10 most inspiring professors at UC Berkeley by College Magazine. He lectures all over the world and has published 6 books. He is currently at work on a research project involving the politics of ice in the era of climate change. Thank you, all panelists and all participants. We look forward to a wonderful exchange that will take place over the next 90 minutes. Darren, I hand the platform over to you to begin and moderate our session.
All right, and I receive the platform from you. Good morning, everyone. We're here to do some serious talking. I'm going to do 2 things here. I'm going to just tell you what I had in mind when I thought of the title of this very briefly, and then I'm going to kind of start with some opening remarks to get the show started. So as I tell you what I was thinking, just this morning, the title of this town hall is, what we say and what they hear. And I didn't, I wasn't trying to emphasize the fact that we're talking and what they hear are different things, but clearly what it was, it's sometimes we feel like, are we even speaking the same language? And what I really had in mind was the idea of we know what we want to say, whoever we are. I'm not assuming we're a liberal Berkeley crowd, whoever we are, maybe we're conservatives, but we almost don't understand how others are getting the point we're making. So maybe we should also focus some attention on what others hear when we talk, which is kind of the first step towards getting some empathy back in the room. So what I want to do, since I figured we could use a little bit of humor, just for a few seconds, I'm going to put this up on the screen. Some of you may remember the wonderful comic strip Far Side. And just this morning, as I was thinking of what we say and what they hear, I remembered these cartoons about what we say to cats and what we say to dogs. So you can read them as I'm talking here. But I think frequently of when I take trips outside of Berkeley and go elsewhere, when I'm in places like Texas or I'm in places like Ohio where I have family, the dialogues are very different, and I really learn a lot from going there because number one, I people say very different things. You get out of the Berkeley bubble. But more importantly, is you realize that if you know how to have the conversation, I've never had a problem. I've never been able to sit down and just say, I can't talk to you. And it's kind of like developing a skill set that says, look, we all know it's a problem that we are increasingly either self-censoring or we are cutting off people because we just don't want to talk to them anymore. And I don't really think that's the best way for us to go. I think a town hall where we figure out how can we? There's always going to be some people that we can't talk to, and I get that. There are limits, but I thought, let's do this. Let's it's an election year, so let's make sure we know what we're doing. So I'm going to start my opening comments here. The three of us are going to just have a few, like 5 minutes or so, 5 to 7 minutes, and just kind of add a few aspects to this. And then we're going to basically maybe do some follow-up questions. And I want to set aside quite a bit of time, of course, because it is a town hall, to hear from all of you. So as I'm speaking, as Cynthia's speaking, as Tamim are speaking, if you have questions or insights, please put them in the, oops, looks like I froze.
We can still hear you though, Darren.
I can
Okay,
still hear
good.
you.
Nothing worse than looking at a frozen picture of myself. I don't know what's up with that. Anyway, so if you do have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat section on Zoom. And after we finish giving our opening remarks, what we'll do is I will go through the chat and be as a moderator and kind of field the questions. If you're trying to ask a question of a specific panelist, just put that in your question. Say, here's a question for Tamim, or here's a question for Cynthia, or something like that. Very quickly, I'm going to on and off my video and see if that fixes this. I think it did. Yay. All right. So here's my opening remarks. I'm going to do the more academic theoretical thing. We reached a point a few years ago that we changed the definition of fascism. Fascism became a word that meant anybody who disagrees with me. And I don't think that's really the healthiest way to start throwing labels around. I was thinking actually quite recently, just a few days ago, the celebrated author Joyce Carol Oates made a statement, and I thought it's perfect for kind of opening the way I want to talk about today's town hall. If you didn't see this, Joyce Carol Oates had made a comment about the Bible, in which she said the Bible's basically nothing other than a great work of fiction. And it's like, okay, I get that, liberals can celebrate. We have to, there's this concern. We have to keep church and state separate. And it's kind of a dig at those, dumb conservative Christians because they believe in all this fictional story. But if you ask, say, persons of faith what they heard, you might get a very different perspective. For instance, they might say, okay, well, then why didn't she say anything about the Quran? Why didn't she say anything about, Tanakh or Jewish scripture? Why not Hinduism? Why is only one religion believed in fiction? Is she saying that all religions are lies? And if not, why didn't she say all of that? And I think those are actually legitimate viewpoints, because if the idea is, well, I don't want to say anything about that group because that would be wrong, it's like, well, what are the rules for what we say? So that brings us into the First Amendment, which is a poorly understood part of our Constitution. There are two parts to the First Amendment. There's one part, yes, about freedom of speech, but there's a second part that's also in the First Amendment that's about religion. And one of the most overlooked parts of the First Amendment is the fact that the First Amendment does not, in fact, call for separation of church and state. Separation of church and state is actually the French model. The French law on secularity says we have to separate church and state. What the First Amendment says in the U.S. Constitution is that we can have religion in politics. That's not a problem. What we can't do is have only one religion, an established religion that is the religion of the United States. That we can't do. That's why we can put "In God We Trust" on our currency, and that's not a violation of the Constitution, because it doesn't say "In the Muslim God we trust" or "In the Jewish God we trust." It simply says "In some God." But the part about freedom of speech has been, through precedent over time, is a very powerful protective thing about freedom of speech. There are very few limits on what we can say. And one of the things we've seen in recent years is we've seen people, and especially liberals, actually clamoring for tighter controls on speech, because the speech that we don't want to hear, we'd like to have it censored or silenced. And we have this confusion. And the way I like to say it is, we think that hate speech means speech we hate to hear. And that's not true. Hate speech has a very specific legal meaning. Hate speech is one of the few forms of speech that are in fact not protected by the First Amendment. But the burden of proof for proving that something is hate speech is very, very high and very strenuous. Some of the landmark cases about freedom of speech, for instance, in some cases, many of you may know the Skokie, Illinois case, in which even when Democratic Socialists in the United States, Nazis, went to a Jewish majority town and started posting swastikas, that was actually protected by the First Amendment. It was not considered hate speech. And the argument of the court was because you can't pin down a specific meaning on what the swastika is. There's about 3 or 4 landmark cases. And so even that one gives you an idea of just how important US law and the Constitution think that our speech, the free speech is. There was an email sent out from the Berkeley administration right after the elections in 2016 that erroneously claimed the First Amendment protects your right to free speech, your right to say certain things, but it doesn't protect you from the consequences of saying them. That's also incorrect. That's the whole point of the First Amendment, is that you can say things without fear of recrimination unless what you're saying actually does cross the line into hate speech. There's been a lot of comedians who have come out, like Dave Chappelle, Ricky Gervais, who are basically saying, not just for comedy, but for democracy, this is a really bad direction for us to be going in. We have to learn how to be able to either hear things we don't want to hear, or know when to listen and not to listen, or when to engage in speech that we may disagree with and be able to have a civil conversation. My last point on this is, of course, going back to kind of the liberal origins of free speech, the philosophical origins, by which I mean John Stuart Mill, whose writings on free speech were actually quite radical for the 19th century. John Stuart Mill went so far as to argue that liberal tolerance should even allow people to publicly declare lies, that things are knowingly untrue. He said we shouldn't even censor those, because it's the only way we can collectively get better and better at being able to filter truth from lies or opinions from truths and things like this. Mill even went so far as to argue that the thing is not just tolerance. It's not like, I don't want to tolerate you. He went so far as to say we need to find a way to actually even respect and understand the points of view of people who think differently from us. Now, Mill, like the First Amendment, there are limits. It's not like if somebody's calling for, say, genocide, we say, well, we respect and tolerate that. But those limits have to be pushed pretty far out, and what we've seen is kind of a narrowing of what we're willing to accept, and I don't think that's healthy for democracy. That's what I'm going to use as my opening remarks. What I'm going to do next is yield the virtual floor over to Cynthia, if you're ready to go. Cynthia, the virtual floor is all yours.
All right, thanks so much. And now for something completely different. No, I mean, just in a certain sense, I had some prepared remarks, so I'm not responding actually to what Darren just said. And I wanted to make 5 kind of short points having to do with the notion of safety and sort of people's sense that they need to be safe when they speak. So the first point, I wanted to make a distinction between safety and comfort. On my campus, De Anza College, I helped organize a teach-in on the Israeli-Gaza war. And the speakers came from a humanistic perspective that honored the tragedy of lives lost on both sides and dug into the history and politics of the present moment. I was worried that hecklers would show up, and some of my colleagues asked that there be campus police present. And we specifically offered those posing questions that they could always write them on paper, that everybody actually wrote their questions on paper, so that people didn't need to be identified publicly with their questions. So even going into this event, which was purely an educational event, though, with particular politics, there was a sense that people felt unsafe being in the room, that people felt unsafe expressing their opinions. And I was actually told later that because our teach-in was sponsored by Jewish Voice for Peace, an organization dedicated to Palestinian rights and an end to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories, that Jewish students on our campus didn't feel safe attending and actually didn't attend our event. And I would say that many of us live in bubbles with people who agree with our positions. And when something changes to bring us face to face with views that disrupt what we've come to accept as common sense, we can often find that experience really deeply destabilizing. And I think that many of us feel silenced by worries that our speech might be met with disagreement. We're in a period of increasing self-censorship where people often don't say what they think is important or true because they're afraid of the social consequences, even in cases where those consequences are probably actually quite small. I think it's often the case that taking the risk to speak our truths actually strengthens our relationships by making them more authentic. Taking the risk to be honest and to speak out often puts us in more right alignment with the people around us. The dictionary definition of the word safety centers on the idea of being free from danger. And much of the current conversation around unsafety and people's feeling of unsafety to speak is actually really not about safety, it's about discomfort. And I think discomfort is something that we should generally lean into. We should reserve the word safety for situations where we feel like we're actually in danger of something more than a destabilization of our worldviews. The second point I want to make has to do with social media. I think it's really important to remember that Facebook and X were exquisitely designed as profit-making advertising platforms. People's outrage is actually the fuel that drives those profits. The platforms are optimized for outrage. So it isn't surprising that people attack one another there. They were designed for that. People gain clout by how many followers they have, and they often gain followers by drawing more eyeballs to their posts. And cancel culture that happens online is a practice in social media where people flame each other, often for clout, quite intentionally. The algorithms foster outrage to keep people engaged. And so in a weird way, social media is such a toxic place precisely because there's generally no danger there. The personal real life stakes are often so low that people feel like they can say whatever they want because they don't have real relationships often with the people that they're engaging in this virtual conversations with. So I think a lot of people sense that it's unsafe to engage in political dialogue comes from the kinds of bad behavior that are routine on social media, where people make comments about social and political things and then they're flamed and sometimes they're canceled. I would argue that there's no point trying to figure out how to have productive, humanistic, civil conversations on social media. The algorithms don't really allow it. I think it's actually better to avoid commercial social media, and we should avoid feeding the trolls. And if you're concerned about social media and what's happening there, you should work actively for policies that break up the monopolies that keep social media as a, I think I said the word, anyway, that keep social media as kind of for-profit entities. So we should think about what are the laws and rules that would allow for the proliferation of functional nonprofit forms of social media. Third point, real danger. IRL, or in real life, we are, of course, actually in a time of real, and I would say increasing danger. And I agree with Darren that people often overuse the word fascism, but I actually think we're in a period of real serious danger of moving towards fascism. 1,200 human souls were killed by Hamas in the terrorist attack on Israel on October 7th. Since that day, 25,000 human souls have been massacred by the Israeli military with bombs paid for by the United States in Gaza. In the United States, hate crimes are increasing against Muslims and against Jews. The climate crisis, of course, is a completely separate subject, is putting millions of people at risk and causing tremendous amounts of danger. Democracy is in peril in the United States and in many places. And we're living in a time where many of our colleagues in the human community don't feel safe because they are deeply physically unsafe. Right now, all around this country, students are being doxxed and losing opportunities for jobs because well-funded organizations are keeping lists of those who speak out against the US-funded Israeli war machine. Teachers who speak out are losing their jobs, and even powerful and prominent people such as the former president of Harvard, Claudine Gray, are losing their jobs. Which brings us to my fourth point. As the great African-American poet and essayist Audre Lorde said, your silence will not protect you. We're living in dangerous times, and it might be tempting in the face of those real attacks to retreat into the comfort of silence. One of the most profound lessons of the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II was that the community's silence did not make it safe. We can't expect in a period of extreme instability and a rising fascist movement in our country to feel safe all the time. Living ethically in times of crisis requires that at least some of us take risks. And of course, the more of us who take risks and speak out and work for justice, the safer we all are. And while this is a time for speaking out and for bravery, that doesn't mean that our words need to be fighting words. A dangerous and consequential time like ours is also a time for being strategic, for thinking about what the most effective ways are to speak and to act into relation to the dangers we face. So my fifth and final point is the role of civil communication. I think it is generally a good idea when speaking with people to follow the basic rules of effective civil communication. We should avoid attacking people personally. We should practice humility, openness, empathy, and good listening. In our communications, we should try to get at underlying shared values. We should remember that as we speak in ways that challenge dominant narratives, some people will feel destabilized. But no amount of civil dialogue will stop the forces that are fighting to maintain social, economic, and political power at the expense of the rest of us and sort of a healthy, thriving human community. I found it very disheartening, even long before Trump came into the political scene, when many Republicans had already begun to fight politically in dirty ways and to not engage in political compromise, that at that time, the response of many liberals was to sort of wring their hands and call for more civil dialogue. Being civil with those who are bent on your destructive is like bringing a knife to a gunfight. Fighting against the forces of fascism in this country does not require us to be routinely uncivil, but it does require of us much more than civility. We engage in significant social change when we pressure political systems to change. We need to step outside of our comfort zones to do that. We need to make those who are abusing their power uncomfortable, and we need to actually out-organize them to take away their power to destroy the fabric of our society. That involves mobilizing social resources to shut down abuses of power that exist in a wide variety of forms. So my last statement is that that our silence will not protect us, but also neither will our civility. And that's it, and I'll turn it over back to Darren.
All right, thanks so much, Cynthia. We have one more speaker left to go, and that's going to be Tamim. Tamim, if you're ready to go, I will take the virtual floor from Cynthia and hand it directly to you. So the virtual floor is yours, Tamim.
Thank you, Darren. I'm going to turn on my my light here so I can. I better not. I guess I'll have to do this without notes. I'm really interested in what's going on generally, you know, in terms of the human community on Earth, what we're going through, and why this is happening. And my thoughts tend to gravitate towards the social impact of technology. And I'm just going to briefly summarize, you know, the arc of history over 5,000 years, and then the arc of what's happening over the last, 10 or 20 years. And so the arc of history over the course of our 5,000 years or 6,000 or 50,000 or whatever it is that technology has tended to ever more interconnect all of us with all of us. And I have to say, when I was born, that was just 75 years ago, the world was full of cultures that didn't know about each other. They knew about whoever was next to them, and they didn't know about somebody that was 500 miles away or on the other side of the planet. And right now we're in a place where every human is somehow interconnected with every other human. So we're all, involved in and included in some network of human activity that blankets the entire planet. We're all in it, and we all depend on it. We can't not be part of it. So that's one thing that's happening. And the other thing that's happening is that the technology of communication and information has created a space that never existed before in human history. And we're all, to some extent, in that space, and that's cyberspace. And cyberspace is rooted in and derived out of digital reality, which ultimately boils down to 0 and 1. That's how it's defined. It's either or, it's black or white, it's 1 or 0. And so digital reality steers us towards sharp borders, sharp not being part of this, being this or that, and it erases blurred areas and gray areas and fuzzy borders. And blurred areas and gray, the fuzzy borders, that's where new ideas emerge. So because we're in this world that needs to move towards some global human community, we're in the process of trying to build a world culture. But we also all need to be part of a culture where we're with our own people, and we can just, live in an analog reality, not a digital reality. And because all of us now, as a result of the accelerating evolution of information and communication technology, we all to some extent live in some way simultaneously exposed to many different cultures that are not our own. And wherever one culture interfaces with another, there's going to be instances where what one person does is not explicable to the other person. There's going to be grinding of gears. And we're trying to build that world culture now. And social media is in there as part of the process of us building this world culture. And social media lends itself to all utterances being labels rather than conversations. I think that, you know, many of the cancel culture things that happen are in some way related intellectually to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that you know, that acronym proposes a fundamental principle of this world culture that we want to build. And it should be diverse, so all cultures have to be part of it. And it should be equitable, so everybody who's part of it is on a par with everybody else. And everybody has to be included in it. So that's great. I think that has to be a feature of the world culture. But at the same time, we have all these individual cultures we're part of, and we crave to be part of it. And everybody who's here is actually part of some culture that, you know, you guys say, well, fascism and, you know, Trump and those guys, they're not, you know, we don't want that culture to be the culture we're living in. I think that's a general feeling all across the globe. We don't want to have the culture that we're in be somebody else's culture. We want it to be our culture. So now, if we're building a world culture, we need that in addition to, not instead of, cultural microcosms that are different from each other and that are protected from one another in terms of, you know, in terms of being able to be with your own people. We want to have a space where with our own people, and we also want a space where we can be with all people. And so in building that space with all people, I say, is cancel culture a good way to arrive at that space? I don't think so. And I think I'm going to leave it there and enlarge on these points in anything that comes up in the discussion.
All right, thank you, Tamim, for that. We'll have plenty of time for the discussion. We're almost at the 11 o'clock point. I do want to go back and just the first thing I want to say is, Tamim, I really liked your point about how blurry areas of where ideas emerge, because it reminds me of why I blur my background on Zoom. I guess that's where all my ideas come from. Sorry, just a little humor there. But let me go back to you know, one of the things we want to focus on today is this idea of how can we talk? So both of you did a fantastic job of this, of basically saying, you know, here are the, you know, we need to remember the rules of civility, or we need to really rethink, you know, what DEI is supposed to bring us to, what cancel culture doesn't take us to. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, for instance. I also appreciate both of you brought up social media, because there's already one question, a couple questions actually, about social media. I'm curious if you have, for instance, any, I don't want to call them tricks, but any tactics, for instance, for, you know, if you find yourself in a discussion with someone who clearly disagrees with you. It doesn't have to be an extreme disagreement, but you know, something where there's disagreement. Do either of you have any insights, for instance, in how to negotiate those? And I'm just, you know, I'm thinking in terms of in real life discussions with people, not social media. But I wonder if you have any tactics or any personal anecdotes about a discussion that could have gone terribly wrong, but ended up being actually a good discussion. And Cynthia, if you don't mind, I'll go back to you to see if you'd like to add anything in response to that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I have an example of not too long ago visiting a cousin who is kind of liberal, who has a husband who is a very right-wing Trump person. And he was a delightful person. I was staying at their house, and you know, I you know, mainly engaged, and he wanted to talk politics, right? He really wanted to get into it. And so, you know, I put myself in that situation of just like remain calm, remain open, remain relaxed, really listen, and then try to find, and not to kind of, every time he said something offensive to me, I wasn't going to like go for it. I wasn't going to bite at it. I was going to think about, how do I make a human connection with this truly decent and likable person, with whom I have a familial connection, and to really listen, and to try to kind of, like I said, that, the kind of being empathetic, common ground, what are your underlying shared values, and to move very slowly from there, and to not, one of the things I think, I know somebody in the chat said, like, what I mean by flame, there's a way that people sort of get into this like hyper, let's insult each other kind of mode. And that's a completely unproductive mode, even if you score some points. So just to think pragmatically about, what are you trying to accomplish, right? And you're almost never gonna change somebody's mind by fighting with them. So that sense of finding common ground, finding the sort of smallest, lowest common denominator where you're going to make a connection and kind of get them to see something your way.
All right. Thanks for that, Cynthia. Tamim, would you like to add an example or an anecdote or a tactic of your own?
Well, I'm a lurker on social media. I'd rather not be on social media at all. But a few years ago, I published this book, The Invention of Yesterday. It emerged right when social media was starting to rise up. And my publisher thought that I should be on social media for the sake of my book. So I'm on Quora, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I have all these accounts, Instagram, I have all of them. And I rarely put anything into them. And what I notice about social media is that if you say anything there, then you get a whole lot of that stuff from everybody else. So what happens on social media are not conversations. They're threads of conversation that are people agreeing with each other.
Mm-hmm.
I said recently to my wife that, now there's this cyberspace reality that all of us live much of our lives in. And she said, no, we don't. A few people are on there, but I'm not on. I say no to most people on Facebook and so on. And what came to me is, I don't know if most people are on social media or not. There's no way for any of us to know, actually, because the impact of technology has turned up in the erosion of the idea of objective truth. So anything that anybody says is as much an expression of who they are in terms of identity, what identity group they're part of, as it is an intellectual statement about their idea of objective reality. The reason we're so concerned about self-censorship is that the only way we can figure out what is actually going on is for each of us to say what we see from where we are, and then to hear what others tell us about what they see from where they are. And that kind of conversation can't happen in a space where all the utterances are only labels announcing what identity group you're part of. So I think we have to find some way to get control of this monstrous social media thing, especially with AI lurking over it now to multiply the effect. I'll leave that there.
All right, that's quite a bit. I'll add to it. Some of you in the OLLI world have heard this from me, but some of you maybe new or not be in that class. One of the things I like to do, and I talked about this in November, because we're all, November is when the holidays start for many people, and it's like, okay, how do I talk to that one cousin who always has this point of view? And I was in Texas for the holidays a few years back, and my father lives in a relatively conservative part of Texas, and there was a family friend who just kind of took this tone of hostility because I was from Berkeley, and he just assumed we would have nothing in common to talk about, and made a thing about it's like, I suppose you think, Trump is blah, blah, blah. And so instead of taking the bait, instead of, as both Cynthia and Tamim said, instead of getting into the, I'm going to cancel you or I'm going to win this debate, what I did, and it wasn't the first time I've done it, but the tactic I have is I took the conversation in the direction not of whether it was Trump, yes or no, but I said, well, here's the values I would want to see in a president, right? Didn't matter if we were talking about Trump or Reagan or Clinton. I was like, here's what I would like a president to be. And we suddenly started having a conversation about what leadership was. And so when I got to the point and I said, these are what I would like to see. I don't think Trump has those characteristics, and that's why I don't think he's an effective president. He could actually see my point. And there's another bit of encouraging news here. Just yesterday in my office hours, I had one of my undergraduate students come in and ask the same questions we're talking about here. It's like, I'm interested in this issue. I feel very concerned about talking with my peers. Her interest, by the way, was in gender-based violence, and she's like, how can I have these conversations with everybody? It's the same concern of being canceled, of saying one thing wrong and everything unraveling. So this is actually a multi-generational concern, and I think that's a good thing. Actually, two last points. For those of you who are reading in the chat, there's a lovely little anecdote from that's shared by Bruce. Thank you, Bruce, for sharing it about also kind of along the same lines about falling out with a friend over politics and then finding a way to get things back together. So thank you for sharing that personal anecdote. The one platform you didn't mention, Cynthia and Tamim, is the worst one of all, which is TikTok. TikTok is absolutely a corrosive platform. And I know so many people who are like, I know that, but it's so addictive. So maybe later we can talk about what's going on with TikTok. Among other things, it's encouraging people to do things like steal cars just because you can.
Right.
If you have a Kia or a Hyundai, you probably know exactly what I mean, because those were the two cars that everybody's being encouraged to steal. In any case, we're here almost about 11:07, and what I want to do is kind of start opening up the questions. I'm going to start going through the chat that I haven't gone through just yet. I would like to call upon, let's see, I'll start with, there's a couple of folks who wanted to add in some questions after this, and Brian, as in Brian Murphy, if you are around, if you can find a way to bring him on in, I'd like to hear if you have a question to start us off, and after that I'll go to Harry Chotner. Brian?
Hi there. Hello, Tamim. Hello, Cynthia. It's good to see and to hear from both of you. I wanted to tease apart and just ask, it seemed to me that Cynthia, you, without explicitly defining it, you drew a line between the kind of personal engagements where one could be civil and want to be and engage a family member, a neighbor in civil discourse, and the political reality of what it means to have a democracy in which two radically different views of the social world are at stake. And Darren, it does strike me that the DEI movement within higher education does actually presume a sort of liberal version of a free speech landscape in which Tamim's point about multiple cultures coexisting is the presumption. Right. So that in colleges and universities, you spend a lot of time providing the space for persons to collaborate together, to engage one another, with the presumption that no one group has as its aim the obliteration of the other. And it seems to me the political stakes are very different, and the kinds of strategies and personal behaviors that are required are very different. If, for instance, the effect of climate change is the radical destabilization of populations in the southern hemispheres, that will mean a continued struggle over immigration and race in the democracies of the North. So I don't see actually a profitable dialogue between a kind of authoritarian, patriarchal, right-wing, proto-fascist movement in the United States who explicitly begins talking about concentration camps, and good liberals wanting to understand. Right. Let's say that's what can happen over Thanksgiving dinner. Between now and November, something else has to happen. And so, Cynthia, I want to just ask you, what did you mean by organizing? Like, what would be ways of not getting along with Cousin Frank?
Yeah.
But defeating a political movement whose goal is to establish an authoritarian structure that is antithetical to the First Amendment.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, Brian. And I just conceptually, I want to, there's the personal, interpersonal that we all, can agree on. Then there's the political, and then there's the sort of public, which is, the sort of like on campus, for example, that sort of thing, where you do have to make space for people to be like rude, obnoxious, terrible, say stupid things, and yet have that be accepted. So what I mean by organizing, I mean, obviously we all know this, right? That there's an election coming up that is truly consequential, as young people are saying. You've told me that for the last 3, and it's like, yeah, and it's still true, and it keeps getting more true. And so the idea of, so for example, I always call it the Stacey Abrams strategy. The idea that one of the most important things for us to do is to engage people in the election who are disengaged. And sometimes people will say, the Democrats have often been split over, do we try to bring, more kind of moderates who maybe are people who are sort of between Biden and Trump, to bring them over to our side? Or do we try to get the disengaged engaged? And I think that what we saw in the last election was that organizing to get the disengaged engaged is really, really crucial, that kind of organizing. I would also say I'm very involved in the climate justice movement. And one of the things that's the most important for me, the organizing that I do in particular, there's lots of work that's important, but the work that I'm engaged in is about stigmatizing the fossil fuel industry. So we're working on trying to pass a law in California to basically require CalPERS and CalSTRS to divest from fossil fuels, SB 252. Why are we doing that? The idea is not to bankrupt them. It's to stigmatize them and say, you are no longer polite members of our community welcome at the dinner table because your business model is dead set on destroying the habitability of this planet. So, and people will sometimes say, like CalPERS and CalSTRS have been arguing, well, but we need to be in dialogue with the fossil fuel industry. And that's even some of the things that have happened at the international climate negotiations, is this idea that we need to sort of stay in dialogue. We don't need to stay in dialogue with the fossil fuel industry. We need to take their political power by any means necessary. Okay, so then so I really agree with you, Brian, that we have to be very careful about when is civility and politeness appropriate, and when is it appropriate to out-organize the other side that is putting billions into destroying the planet.
All right, thanks for that, Cynthia. Tamim, would you like to add anything to that, or you don't
Well,
have to? The option.
I think I'm going to go off on a tangent here for a moment, but I've spent a lot of time in Kentucky this last year, and I keep going back and forth, and I'm really struck by the change, by the fact that I'm in one culture over there and I'm in a completely different culture here. And I will just state that right here, what I'm doing here, and all of you who are with me, this is a culture. And it's not the culture that I find myself in when I go in Kentucky and I get immersed there. And I'm sure that most of the people I run into, we don't talk about Trump, we don't talk about the election. We talk about, what brand of beer do you drink and what do I drink? We can disagree about that without making each other feel unsafe. But I know that, I'm in Trump country, and I can see that there's a whole context there, a whole cultural context that, that makes sense of why they would vote for Trump. That's a place where, in the physical reality, life has collapsed. Things are pretty bad, It's a landscape that 20 years ago, it's a social landscape that 20 years ago didn't look anything like that. And so when I think about utterances that give rise to attacks, people attacking each other, what I keep thinking about is that every utterance has its full meaning from the context that exists for the person who's saying that. The context is the thing that we don't have when all of the conversation is on social media or in any media, actually. You don't see that. You need to be physically in contact with other people. So that's the thing I wanted to say. I don't know how it connects to what you guys were saying, but I think that's part of the question here.
No, I think it connects very well. I mean, I have the same experience when I go visit family in Ohio and in Texas. It's like there's a different world, there's a whole different context, and I have found I've had reasonably constructive conversations. Although Brian's point about, there's a comment, it's kind of a comment and a question, it's more of a comment from Stephen in the chat that brings up Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance, this idea that in order to maintain a society, we have to retain the right to be intolerant of intolerance. It's the paradox of tolerance, as it's called. The problem is we don't have a definition, or we don't have a, when I was talking about the First Amendment, and I said, when something is hate speech, it's not just hate speech. Hate speech is actually protected by the First Amendment, and somebody pointed this out in the chat. But a certain kind of hate speech, when it crosses a line into actually inciting violent harm towards others, is the kind of hate speech that's banned. And got a couple questions in the chat also about, what is cancel culture? We've been talking about cancel culture. Cancel culture, to me at least, is that confusion of we become intolerant of anything we don't agree with. And that's too narrow of a definition. So with Karl Popper and the intolerance of intolerance, we need to know where that line is. We need to collectively define some point that says, yes, if somebody's talking about, say, concentration camps, as Brian brings up, there's a point where I'm like, that's crossing this line, but we don't agree on where the line is. And so we tend to just cancel everything that's outside of our own lines, or kind of our tribal lines, so to speak. That's just my 2 cents worth there. I'm gonna thank you, Brian, so much for getting things started. I do want to see if Harry Chotner's there, and if you would like to throw in a question too, as I keep going through the chat, and I'll start pulling questions out of the chat.
Yeah, just one question. First of all, Cynthia, Tamim, Darren, thank you so much. Incredibly helpful. And Brian, as usual, got the text right. That's the question that I think he posed. But I want to go to a footnote. Nothing as important as the text. It seems to me that a lot of our conversation is about going home and how do we talk to people who blah, blah. The people that I have in mind when I'm listening to you is people to the right of us. And I want to raise the question of people to the left of us, because I think it's a whole different set of issues. And so if I'm dealing with a Trump person, that's one thing. If I'm dealing with a Palestinian or an African-American or somebody who's racially, class, religiously, culturally different from me and could be perceived as to the left of me, the dynamic is very different. And the anxiety it produces is very different. And cancel culture does refer to that, but mostly I don't feel like we've talked about that. And self-censorship, I don't think students are self-censoring because they're afraid that young Republicans in class are going to trash them. That's not who they're self-censoring about. So I was just curious to hear what you think about how we push the dialogue with people who are, quote, to the left of us, in however you want to define that, and who have a certain, therefore, kind of moral authority that certainly Republicans don't have for most of us, etc. Because I think it's a slightly different set of emotional, psychological, and ethical issues. So I just wanted to ask for your thoughts.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Harry. I mean, you're right. I mean, I'm hearing from more and more, even from undergraduates, this you're right. They're doing the self-censoring, but you're right. They're not concerned about if they're a liberal student, is it a Republican? It's like their fellow students, they don't know where the lines are, so they're afraid to say anything. So this time around, I'm going to go in reverse order. Tamim, would you have a response for Harry? You don't have to have one, but would you like to add something?
Well, I do actually, because I think mostly I've been talking about people to the left of us, and what I'm concerned about is that I think there's a serious danger that within a year and a half or something, we'll be living in a fascist country, and the United States of America won't exist as the country we know it. We've known it all our life to be. So I'm concerned about that, and I'm concerned about the fact that the right isn't canceling each other, and we are. I feel like, I'm not a Maoist, but let's evoke an old Maoist phrase: "Unite all who can be united." And we're not doing that. We're engaged in a process. The cancel culture is a process that divides us into fragmented groups. So that's why I'm particularly concerned about that, and that's my response to what you're saying. I'll just say one further thing. Kentucky and San Francisco. My sister came here one time, long time ago, but it was like 10 years ago or something. And my neighbor who was from New York was conversing with her. And I could see that they didn't understand each other. And here's what I realized was happening. His conversation was all trying to fathom or trying to ferret out, trying to open her up into what was she doing to try to get out of Kentucky. He thought he could, had some suggestions about that. He didn't realize she likes living in Kentucky. She's not trying to get out of it and live in San Francisco or New York.
Can I take this one too?
Yeah, go ahead, Cynthia.
And so I saw in the chat, somebody had asked, like, can we define cancel culture? Because I want to say that cancel culture is a term of the right that's used toward the left, right? So I really, really avoid using that word. But then the deeper question that you're raising, which I think all three of you is an important question, which is about, like, on liberal college campuses, let's just say, the sort of self-censorship of people who might have slightly more conservative views. And what I would say is, I'm very far to the left, I will say, and I teach and I do a lot in my classes to make sure that it's a place where students with all perspectives feel comfortable to say their points of view. And I'll often elevate the views of a student with whom I disagree in order to kind of make it so that there's not a kind of a let's all jump on that person and shut them down, right? And so when we talk about people being canceled, I think it's important to think about, what do we mean? Some people, what they mean by that is they said something that was to the right of the dominant view in the class, and people vigorously disagreed with them. That's not cancel culture. That's not being canceled. That's being disagreed with. And so I think as the political culture on a lot of liberal campuses has moved further to the left, views, and I saw somebody say this in the chat too, that views that used to be unpopular, sort of anti-racist views, anti-homophobic views, et cetera, those views are becoming more hegemonic. They're becoming more the dominant normative view, whereas it used to be a kind of a more, I would say, I grew up where the dominant normative view was pretty racist, pretty sexist, pretty homophobic, pretty unconcerned about disabled folks, et cetera. That's shifted. And so now when people have views which are unpopular and they're sort of used to living in a space where those views are unquestioned, they find that uncomfortable. So that's just one thing I would say, is that we need to sort of disaggregate what we're talking about here. And I saw somebody put in the chat, Al Franken, yes, was canceled in the sense that people said his behavior was unacceptable. There are many things I liked about Al Franken. I think he was quite a good senator, but I think as the Me Too movement has emerged, it is now unacceptable for a public figure to engage in forms of sexual harassment, for example. I don't want to go into like the details about the Al Franken case, and I don't feel informed enough to adjudicate that one. But people are saying, like, no, your behavior is actually unacceptable. I think that's a good thing. And then the right wing it uses this phrase cancel culture to say, when people say your view is unacceptable to me. But you have to always look, what are the sort of discursive saying, I disagree with you, I don't like you, I don't want to talk to you anymore. And what are the things where people really like Al Franken actually lose their job, lose their position, have violence against them? I think we need to disaggregate those sort of different aspects of what we're talking about.
Great, thank you for that, Cynthia. I'm going to go over to the chat now. I'm trying to. We have a lot of questions that come in, and they kind of relate to each other. So I'm going to go. There's about 6 or 7 so far that have come in, because we've talked about, not just empathy, but about, how do we either restore civility or have a civil discussion? And people are saying yes, but what are those rules? Do we need to rewrite the rules? Or if we all come from different cultures? And we've been talking a lot about political left and right, but there was one person saying, different cultures have different rules. And I'm going to jump in here briefly, and I talk a lot about this in my OLLI classes and other classes, and it's just one of these things I believe in. Many of you know I'm a language nerd, but let's take just a random culture like Japan. Speaking Japanese is only half of understanding what it means to be in Japan. The other language you need to speak is the context, like understanding what Kentucky is, as Tamim said, understanding what a Republican world is, understanding, the unwritten rules of Japanese culture, things you don't say, things you don't do. And people pick up on that. And I have found this is an extraordinarily valuable skill that, for instance, Tamim, I don't know what your experiences have been, but when you're in Kentucky and people maybe expect that you don't know Kentucky and suddenly they realize you do, they're like, oh, you're one of those Californians. You probably think we all just drink Jack Daniels or something like that. I find that people respond very positively when you have taken the time to understand their cultural environment, like you said, of thinking, not assuming that somebody in Kentucky wants to get out. It's served me very well in terms of doing what you might call background research or just asking questions like, how are things done? It's why I'm in Ohio. I can be Ohioan. I don't adopt the accent because I can't say wash when I see WASH. I still call that wash, but that's okay. They'll forgive me for that. So I'm curious as to, people are asking about, I want to have a civil conversation, but who gets to define what is civil? And this goes back to this idea of very pragmatic skills that we can use to have civil discussions. Again, going back to Brian's point, of course, there's going to be these limits at the extremes. But Tamim, actually, I'll start with Tamim again. Tamim, do you have any idea of, when you say civility, what do you mean? Does it change when you go to Kentucky? Or is it there's a general principle that you think is universal there?
I don't know if there's a general principle that's universal. I think bringing up the word rules when you're talking about trying to talk across cultural borders and frontiers is sort of the indicative of the problem. Because within a culture, I think, I am from two cultures. I was born Afghan and I was born American. So I sort of know something about being in each of two cultures. And what I know is that to behave in a way that people say, oh, that's a good guy, he's really behaving well. In Afghan culture, you wouldn't be able to say what are the rules. You just didn't have an intuition of it. And when you come to America and you're an American and you're behaving like an American should, you wouldn't be able to identify all the things that you do that's good, proper behavior. You intuit it. There's a gentility that you sort of evolve and grow into. And what I'm saying about this world project that's underway right now is we're trying to find a way to develop a culture that actually all people all over the world can be in that culture and speak to each other civilly with having an intuition of how a human being should behave. And, and it takes time. What it takes is actual conversations happening, and I think that if I can bring up an example of something that is very alive in my mind right now. I taught an OLLI class and I had to take a course that the University of California, Berkeley online made me do that had to do with sexual harassment and sexual violence and sexual harassment. And it was online and, yes or no, and here's the situation, and here are three terms. Which would you call this term? Which term applies to this situation? And what struck me is, ultimately the purpose of this course is to make me a better human. And this course is not going to do it. This course is not going to make me be a person who is less likely to engage in what this course identified at the outset as SVSH, because it was going to be cumbersome to say sexual violence, sexual harassment. So there was an acronym that was then used throughout the course. I'm saying to take a human interaction situation, which is so full of complexity and nuance that arises in real life situations, and turn it into an acronym that can then be referenced with 4 letters is what is the problem here. There's something about that terrifies me. So.
All right, thank you for that, Tamim. Cynthia, any thoughts on? I guess rules was too strong of a word, but it's there's those unwritten things. It's like how do we keep, or how can we get back this idea of civil discourse? Somebody saying, if we don't even agree on facts, and we can come back to that in a second. But if when you think of civility, what are the things you think of, Cynthia?
Yeah, but I think I do want to go back to Tamim's point, and that's what anthropologists teach us too, right? That that there are no universal rules here. This is where I'm going to be a relativist. And I do think that sort of, within the kind of, liberal Western society, which is partly in many ways becoming the world hegemonic society in all kinds of complicated ways, that there are best practices emerging, but I don't believe that there are universal rules here. Actually, I really, really don't. Or even norms, and I'm not sure that there should be, but I think that, and so I think, and I had earlier, I kind of spit out my kind of sense of, in the context that we all here in this room are in, that there are some basic, best practices that I think that people should follow. But even, go back to the sort of that horrible Elise Stefanik versus the 3 college presidents moment that we had a month or so ago. That question, is calling for genocide hate speech? That actually is that's one of the reasons that the whole thing blew up, was not just that those presidents were prepared, but that's actually a case that's on the edge in a way that's really, really complicated. I think it's complicated.
Yes, I think we can all agree it's complicated. That's why things like town halls. By the way, if you don't know this term, one of the things I'm thinking of listening to everyone talk is it's a good term to think of. It's called code switching. And what code switching is where you are familiar with different cultural environments. I'm not a different person when I go to Ohio. I'm not a different person when I go to India. But, through deep immersion and being willing, open to learning different ways, you kind of know there are different ways of doing things. Like I said, I might not say Warsh, but I know how to be Ohioan. I know that in Texas, for instance, people in Texas are really, one of my students said unnervingly friendly. It's like I was in Texas and everybody was just like, you go to the 7-Eleven and you have a half-hour conversation with the person who's selling you a pack of gum. For instance, in Texas, nobody asks if anybody has any food preferences, or what, it's like nobody's like, are there any vegans? It's just not asked. I'll volunteer information if I have any, but it's in the Bay Area, it's like on an invitation, so and so is getting wedding, please check off your food things and stuff like that. That's how we do things here, but other parts of the country don't do that. They're kind of learning. I noticed that menus change and things like that, but code switching, is our ability to be in different environments, and that code, while it might not be hard and fast rules, as Tamim pointed out, people pick up on our ability to understand there are different ways of seeing the world, different ways of doing things. And to me, it generates this modicum of respect that allows a civil conversation to start. I simply can't be Berkeley everywhere I go. I can be Berkeley in Berkeley, but elsewhere, it looks like I just don't really want to hear or understand that people may think and act differently from me. We do have quite a few questions here, by the way, in the chat, and they're good questions. We've talked a bit about social media. Cynthia and Tamim, you did as well, including some folks who are saying, how can I appear relevant in a conversation if I don't do social media? And I can do a short answer on that, which is, knowing about social media is different than being on social media. So, knowing the different platforms and what they are actually is usually enough. But there's, a lot of people are pointing out, social media really is a problem. Brevity is the problem. That basically social media truncates our perspectives. X, formerly Twitter. I still can't bring myself to say X. I'm sorry. It's just a dumb name. Started off this idea of, nothing more than a small number of characters. So let's go back to the social media thing, because there's sometimes a belief that there's this generational divide, that the younger generation are obsessed with social media, and how can we have that conversation? It's one of the reasons I do my intergenerational dialogue project. I'll start here with Cynthia. Cynthia, would you like to add some thoughts to folks who are saying, in essence, I see social media as the problem, but I'm also not a social media person, so how can I enjoy that conversation?
Gosh, I mean, I think I am sort of on the extreme don't do social media side of things. I mean, I was on Facebook for a while until the algorithms made it completely uninteresting to me. And so, I mean, I don't know, I guess I would say that you know, there are even ideas of relevance that are being sort of generated by social media culture. I think I'm relevant. I think I'm relevant. I think I have good conversations. I talk with young people all the time. And yes, it's true. I do know what I read news about social media, so I kind of know what the different platforms are. But I don't think what's happening on there is something that older folk who are not there need to be on. Really, honestly, I think that it's really, really toxic and undermining our democracy, and its toxicity has to do with its commercial underpinnings, right? And the way that the government has allowed monopolies, right? So that Facebook was able to buy up other platforms, and whenever a new thing starts to emerge, the megas buy them, and so I'm with Elizabeth Warren. It all needs to be regulated. And so I would encourage you to not worry about it, actually. And
Okay.
not worry about social media. We need to worry about social media. Not worry about not being there and being relevant. Have authentic, real conversations with people, and we're good.
Okay. Tamim, you want to add anything to that?
I want to say exactly the same thing, Cynthia. Stay off it. Just don't do it. I'm on all the platforms, but I don't say anything. Like I say, I just lurk.
Okay. One of the few times I guess lurking is a good thing.
Yeah.
But really, I mean, I will say there's an interesting kind of, it's a very interesting moment. I mean, one of the things I love about what I do, being able to teach on a campus, is it puts me in contact with people, you know, of different ages, and I just get to experience on a daily basis. And I've discovered, yes, there are plenty of say undergraduate age students who'll say things like, I know social media is toxic, especially, you know, TikTok. I know it's toxic, but I'm addicted to it. But there's a growing number of you know, whatever you want to say, Gen Z undergraduate students who don't just recognize the toxicity of social media, are actually starting to log off. You know, because
Yeah.
I find in my
Yeah.
classes when I say, look, I'm not on social media, it's not because I don't get it. It's because I do get it. And the more you understand it, the more you'll realize it's, you know, not a good thing. You know, it's yesterday, I was talking with a student in my office hours, and there's a streaming service called Spotify where most students, you know, consume their music. It's like you pay a monthly subscription. In fact, it's free for students on campus. And you know, I have found I'm heavily into vinyl, because when I listen to vinyl, nobody knows what I'm listening to. I don't get an email from Spotify saying, if you liked that, we think our algorithm thinks you will like this. And I also don't like Spotify because it underpays artists. And lo and behold, the student said, yeah, a lot of us are just getting off of Spotify as well. So it's interesting. So that this
Yeah.
idea of, you know, it's no longer how can we convince them or show them. I think they're learning it on their own. And to be honest, gives me a tremendous sense of hope. I've even heard, brace yourself, I've even heard students say they're thinking of exchanging their smartphones for flip phones.
Oh yeah,
I've
my
heard
son
that
did
too.
that. My
So,
son
you
did
know,
that. Lots of kids are doing that, right? Yeah.
yeah,
And then unfortunately it's hard to get directions and bus maps and stuff like that. But yeah, I think if you had a phone that did bus maps and things like that, yeah, absolutely. No, lots of people are doing that.
yeah. Well, I tell my students there's nothing more fun sometimes than getting lost. You learn a lot of things by getting lost. So not having maps is not necessarily a bad thing here. Let's see. Let me go back to the our chat here. We got some new questions rolling in. Thanks to all of you, by the way. There's a request here to basically talk about whether or not we can address this growing perception that, for instance, going back to democracy, that, you know, if you want to look at hyperpartisanship, and I think we're still unfortunately in a moment of hyperpartisanship because it is an election year. Do you have any thoughts on how we can kind of break through this idea that we all know there's a crisis of democracy or a crisis of civility, but we're also convinced that it's the other side that's the problem? I like the fact that, you know, Tamim, actually Cynthia and Tamim, you were both talking about how, you know, that you're really addressing people within the same tribe now, that the tribe is basically complicated and you're talking people to both the left, but also the right. Any thoughts on the idea that, you know, somebody else is always the problem? Do you have any thoughts on a bit of self-reflection or looking in the mirror or anything along those lines? Tamim, I'll start with you, or actually,
Sorry.
Cynthia, I'll start with you.
Okay. Look, I think that there is a a crisis of civility on both sides, right? I do think that as people, as Harry Troitner said, that there is a problem of sort of people on the left and people on the right sort of not being civil and not being open to different opinions and all that. I think the crisis of democracy is not a both sidesism. I really don't. And I think that people need to take really, really seriously that we almost lost what we have of democracy, in the transition in 2020. I mean, when you go back and look at it, there were a bunch of very small moments that if the right person hadn't done the right thing, we would no longer have had a sort of a legitimate electoral transfer of power. I think that the crisis of democracy is on the right. I'm sorry. I don't think that there is one thing, the left is too powerless to right now be like, on the verge of like having a Marxist overthrow of liberal democracy. Like that's not happening, right? And I do think on the liberal and left side, there is a sort of a united front to fight fascism, which, I mean, I'm sorry, but I really do think that we need to take it super, super seriously. The crisis of democracy is about people who are not respecting the kind of consensus that has emerged over the last few hundred years of basic rule of law, and elections which are illegitimate and taken seriously. I think we cannot underestimate how much that's not a both sides are bad thing.
Agreed. Tamim, any thoughts on that?
Absolutely ditto on that. I think the crisis that we're looking at that's totally real and we should be concerned about is the possibility that democracy is going to be destroyed in the next 12 months. It's like that's I think absolutely the case. I still think that there is an underlying situation that we need to think about and look for ways to address this growing problem. And I don't exactly think it's polarization. I think it's unraveling of social fabric. I think it's fragmentation. And so I keep thinking about what we can do, what I can do to be able to be in conversation with people who I don't agree with on these crisis issues. And I'll just give you an example. I stopped watching football, even though I love football. I stopped watching it because the NFL is such a horrible, such an example of everything that's horrible in American culture and supports the growing move towards fascism. But I decided, wait, no, we can't do that. We can't start, living in a different world of entertainment, sports. Don't shop at Home Depot, all of us separating. No, we mustn't do that. If I run into somebody who's a Trump supporter and I want to engage in a conversation, we have to have something to talk about that isn't Trump first. So I've started watching football again. That's just one little example. And, I want to just mention something that you said before, which is absolutely true. Cancel culture is a term that originated lives in the right-wing information sphere. But the thing is, there is a phenomenon. And if we don't have a word for it, we can't talk about it. If the right wing's word for it is the only word for it, then that's how we're going to talk about it. We have to come up with a word for this thing because I think this thing exists.
Okay. Well
Darren,
said.
can I just make two quick little points? So
You can make two quick little points. Go right ahead.
Intolerance on the left is the word I would use for that, sort of liberal or left intolerance. The other thing is that there's something happening in the election that I think is really important, which people call deep canvassing, the idea that you go to somebody's door and you have a long conversation where you mostly listen. That's all I want to say.
All right. Thanks for adding those in. There's a specific question here, but it kind of resonates with a few other questions. And if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of take this first because it deals with my class I taught earlier for OLLI on civility. This is a question from Jillian who's saying, how do I negotiate this? It's like, I'll provide information when I'm talking with, say, family or siblings, and I'll quote sources, Washington Post, Atlantic, NBC News, only to have those dismissed as liberal media and then get Fox sound bites thrown back at me. I think a lot of us have been there. So I'll put it this way. So Washington Post, Atlantic, NBC News would in fact be on the political left, and of course Fox is going to be on the political right. But here's what I do, and this goes back to my earlier discussion of code switching and also Cynthia and Tamim's points. I actively read conservative news. I read and watch conservative news, and I do so not with the idea, like I read National Review on a regular basis, just like I would read, say, the New Yorker. It's a conservative magazine, and I don't read it like to see how stupid they are or something like that. I mean, there's a difference between the conservative media and fascism. We've got, we can't think that anything on the political right is fascism. And what it does is it gives me a point of view. It's like if they say, well, this is on Fox News, it's like, I saw that program too. It changes everything. It's like, oh, wait, you watched Fox News? It's like, yeah, I'm not necessarily a conservative. I wouldn't identify myself, either way. Or I saw this in National Review, and suddenly it's like, oh, you saw what I saw. It's kind of like watching football, although I guess National Review is not as exciting as football, but it's the same kind of thing. It's like there's this. We thought there was an antagonism, but in fact, you disarm that with a commonality. And it's not as bad as you would think it is. If you're used to watching liberal news or used to watching conservative news, watching different news, I think is a very healthy thing because it lets us know what other people are hearing and listening. Here we are, what we say, what they hear. Well, how about, what are they watching? I'd like to watch that too. Because it gives me, like I said, it gives me some common ground to start with. And I think that really opens up a larger space for a civil conversation. Tamim or Cynthia, I don't know if you have anything to add to that as well, beyond watching more football.
No,
All
I
right.
don't think that.
Go ahead, Cynthia.
No, I was gonna say, no, don't have anything to add to that one.
Okay, fair enough. Let's see. Gonna sift through some of these questions here. I'm trying to there we go. So somebody asked about a facsimile, and it's because now, and then later on it said, see, cancel culture is one problem, but so is autocorrect and spell check. Somebody was very concerned about facsimile. I was like, what are you concerned about facsimile? He's like, I meant fascism.
Yes.
So, I'd like to make the point one more time and talk about this idea that, let's not confuse conservatives with fascists. But I think there's also a point where we have to recognize there is a bit of extremism in the air. And I think everyone has this concern. Tamim said, within 12 months, things can go in a very different direction. So, the question that comes out is, how do we get, the question is, how do we get the left wing united? But I would say, how do we get the left wing united? And I think, quite frankly, I think you'd find there are conservatives who are equally concerned. But, so what is the approach if we're concerned about extremism or fascism actually taking root? Tamim and Cynthia, where do we start with that? Because that's a conversation you can have. Brian's point is right. There's a point where if somebody's talking about concentration camps, I'm not going to say, let's have a cup of tea and talk about that. It's like there's a point where that's not something we can engage. So do you have any thoughts on where to start with that in terms of how we could confront that very real threat that's emerging in the American democratic landscape? I'll start with Tamim. Any thoughts?
Well, I think, I think there are conservative Republicans who are starting to be not very much heard, part of the group that's going to possibly be part of the United Front to stop the fascism in November. I see people who were prominently conservative types who appear on MSNBC. Too many of them don't appear anywhere, and they're cowards that are silent. But I have some hope that down below the level of noise, because the noise, the proto-fascist right wing is much noisier than everybody else. So it's possible to think they're everybody, or that there's a wave of this thing. I think just having conversations in real life with as many people as possible and trying to have them be conversations in which you're opening up to seeing the whole part of the other person's point of view. That's all I can do, and that's what I'm going to keep doing.
Okay.
Cynthia,
And I, who who spend my life organizing, right? That's what in training organizers, that's what I do. I think it's important to start with the distinction, let's put some definitions on this, that there are conservatives who are good people and believe in the rule of law, and we need to make an alliance with them. And then there are people who are not proto-fascist, but pro-fascist. In other words, I think that the MAGA movement at this time is pro-fascism. The definition of fascism, to me, okay, this won't be a quite clean dictionary definition, but if you don't believe in supporting the rule of law and that you want the government to have the power to do what it wants to people without limits, right? And so something like that. So if you are pro-fascist, we need to figure out ways to out-organize you. And there's a longer, slower conversation about, it's so interesting, right? In the 2016 election, that there were people who were both pro-Bernie and pro-Trump because they were just mad at the system, right? And so there are plenty of people who could be brought out of a fascist position, but there are also a book that I think is very helpful for this moment is Steve Phillips's How We Win the Civil War. And he makes the argument that we are still living through the Civil War, not a new Civil War, but the old Civil War. And that there are people in this country who are more committed to white supremacy than they are to democracy. And those people, there may be some good conversations people can have, but right now in the next, however many months we have left, we need to out-organize those people. And that means making sure that people feel that there's a reason to vote. I was thrilled that Joe Biden shut down the permits for the LNG terminals in the Gulf, because part of what that means is that young people who care about the climate may actually vote for him. He needs to do something about issues, the issue with Israel and Gaza, in order to have people actually vote for him. So we need to organize. We need to have deep conversations with people who are marginal and may not vote.
Okay. Thank you for that, Tamim and Cynthia. We are getting to our last few minutes here, and I'm going to try to do one more round before I let Susan have the last word to take us out at noon. There was a comment earlier about someone saying, that the, younger generation saying things like they're just not really engaged with politics. It's not that important. And I think there are important reasons for it. I understand it, because if you came of age in American democracy since 2016, you have not had an election that you felt excited about. And I kind of get that. But, we can talk about now about how we have to get engaged and get angry and find a way to get the pro-fascists, prevent them from taking power. And yet you also have people who are not really engaged with the system, because it's like, in fact, the quote from the question was, Trump might get elected. And then it was, well, it's only 4 years, so we can just move on after that kind of thing. And I've heard that as well. It's just kind of like, there's this feeling that American democracy is not for me anymore. So, that's one cluster of questions. There's also the fact that the way information is produced, which is, kind of enhances that. We got a couple comments, someone saying, Fox News does a much better job at vilifying their targets, which is, I think better here is actually a negative use. And then somebody's asked the outright question of like, what do we do with the lies supported by the media? And as you pointed out earlier, Cynthia, social media, like all media, is chasing profits, and they'll go with the kind of drama that will attract readers and sell things. So between the poor quality of information and in many ways kind of a crisis in leadership that's getting the next generation of American, I don't want to say American Democrats, but of Americans involved in democracy, there doesn't seem to be the excitement factor, or there doesn't seem to be the factor that's stirring people up to realize what's at stake. So I'm wondering if either of you have any thoughts on how, those of us who really we know it's at stake, can convince others that being engaged is actually worth it. And Cynthia, I will start with you if you have any insights on that.
Yeah, and that, I feel like I spent so much of my adult life saying to other people on the left, let's not overuse the word fascism. And I think now we can't underuse the word, right? And so I think that for young folks to let them know what's at stake, and that and how dangerous it is what the MAGA Republicans are working for, that view of what they want, and to not pull our punches about it, and to be really clear, really direct, and to be really clear and direct about what's at stake, because it's a lot.
Yeah. Tamim, anything to add to that?
I'll just say one thing. I think we should not call them MAGA Republicans. We should call them the MAGA crowd or something, because this is a thing that has emerged in American society, and I bet the core of it is much smaller than it is, than the noise it makes. And I think language counts, and I think we should identify that as a group, not the rest of us. So I'm going to start just calling them maggots.
Okay, thank you for that. We're almost out of time here. I'll add one thing to that, which is, it's someone has entered a comment that says, politics is about who hates who, and on the one hand, it's kind of like, I get that, but I think another problem that we all have, and I think one of the things that might be fueling this growing awareness, like I said, even my undergraduate students are kind of like they're kind of learning on their own that maybe this social media stuff isn't good. I think there's this point of where people want an election. Like I said, if you came of age in the 2016 election, I'll tell you how it was on Berkeley's campus. Undergraduates are like, Bernie is our choice. We all want Bernie. And then that disappeared. 2020, we want, Bernie Sanders. It's like, and then we were ignored again. And I think if you got not, those on the MAGA side of things, but if you got conservatives and liberals together, I think what we hunger for is an election where we can finally vote for something as opposed to voting against something. And maybe that's a place to start thinking about, that's kind of a crisis of leadership, somebody who can inspire. And I don't mean just one person, one great leader, maybe that's part of our job, is in trying to inspire people to say, we can have the conversation, and getting involved is definitely worth it, to kind of battle against the growing plague of cynicism, maybe. Let me ask Cynthia and Tamim, before I turn it over to Susan to kind of start wrapping things up, would you have any final comments you'd like to add? We're only got about a few minutes left, but if you have any quick comments, anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, I feel like I just want to jump into the last thing, but I'll just say it really briefly. Part of it is the problem is that we have a two-party system. So, where the Democrats, in fact, have been captured by corporate elites, and people don't like that. So it is really hard to make the case. So we need things like fusion voting, ranked choice voting, et cetera, to have something that young folk who are more radical could vote for.
All right. Thanks for that. Tamim, any last thoughts or insights?
If a leader could emerge, it would be someone who would get up and say what everybody's thinking. The trouble is we don't know what everybody's thinking. That's a cultural problem. We're fragmented as a culture. There is no us. So that's the thing that we have to work on.
All right. Well, if I could be an optimist, Tamim, I guess it's good news that at least people are thinking. So maybe that's something. All right. We're almost out of time. So I am going to yield the virtual floor. Thanks so much, Tamim and Cynthia, for your insights. Susan, the virtual floor has now been passed on to you to take us out.
Yeah, Darren, thank you very much. And Cynthia and Tamim, thank you for all of the ways in which you have thought about these issues and conveyed them today. I want everyone to know that OLLI will continue with this discussion. It's going to be throughout this entire spring semester at Berkeley. And a couple of things, there will be another town hall meeting that will take place in April. I think it's April 19th. Again, Darren will be our convener, and we will talk about the strategies and civic engagement in the 2024 elections. So we will drill down further into some of the tactics and, as I said, strategies of what lies ahead. But there will be on most weeks of this term, of the winter term and the spring term, there will be other discussions that will pertain to many of the questions that we were starting to talk about today, touched upon. Next week, we will have Annette Siegel, who has been teaching our coaching program, where we're bringing undergraduates and OLLI members together to talk about self-efficacy. Annette will come in and talk with us. This will be nuts and bolts. How do you have a difficult conversation? We started to touch upon that today about what civil language is. I am one from Ohio as well as Darren, who I see it as my duty to be Berkeley wherever I am. And so we've got, different roles that we can play depending upon the context and what we see as our responsibilities. And so you, as OLLI members today and participants in this discussion, I want to thank you. And I hope that we see you in the other events ahead. Thanks again.